It was a bright, sunny morning on Jake's little farm. The sun peeked over the hills, painting the sky with gold and pink. Birds chirped happily in the trees, flapping their wings like they were saying, "Good morning," to the world. The crops in Jake's fields stood tall rows of green corn and golden wheat swaying in the soft wind. Everything looked peaceful. Everything felt perfect. If you walked by, you'd think nothing exciting ever happened here. But oh, you'd be so wrong. Jake was the guy who lived on this farm. He wasn't loud or fancy. He was just a regular guy, tall, with messy brown hair and hands that always had a little dirt on them. He wore old jeans and a faded blue shirt every day. Most of the time, you'd find him outside, working on his favorite thing in the world, his old red tractor. That tractor wasn't shiny or new. It had scratches and dents, and sometimes it made funny noises like put put put. But Jake loved it. He'd sit there for hours, fixing it, cleaning it, or just patting it like it was his best buddy. The people in town knew Jake. They liked him a lot. When he walked down the street with his quiet smile, folks would wave and say, "Hey, Jake. How's the farm?" He'd nod back and say, "Good, thanks," in his soft voice. The kids in town thought he was cool because he'd let them climb on his tractor sometimes. The old ladies liked him because he'd carry their heavy bags from the store. Even the dogs wagged their tails when he walked by. Yup, Jake was a good guy. Almost everyone agreed. But not everyone. Oh no, there was one person who didn't like Jake at all. One person who looked at him and wrinkled her nose like he was a stinky sock. Her name was Karen. And trust me, Karen was trouble with a big T. She didn't think Jake was nice or cool or anything good. To her, he was just a dusty, dirty farmer who didn't belong anywhere near her perfect little life. She had no clue at all what was coming her way. And that's where the story gets really fun. Before we go on, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? I'd love to know. Now, let's talk about Jake's farm for a minute. It wasn't big like those giant farms you see in movies, with fancy machines and tons of workers. Nope, it was small, just a cozy patch of land with a little wooden house, a red barn, and fields that stretched out behind it. The house had a porch where Jake liked to sit in the evenings, sipping lemonade and watching the sun go down. The barn was where he kept his tractor and some tools. And the fields. That's where he grew his food: corn, wheat, and even some carrots for the rabbits that hopped around. Every morning, Jake woke up early. Like, really early, before the sun even thought about getting out of bed. He'd pull on his boots, grab a cup of coffee, and head outside. First, he'd check the crops. He'd walk through the rows, looking at the plants, making sure they were growing strong. Sometimes he'd pull a weed or two, just to keep things neat. Then he'd head to the barn and say hello to his tractor. "Morning, old friend," he'd say with a grin. He'd check the oil, tighten a bolt, or wipe off some mud. That tractor was his pride and joy. The town Jake lived in was small too. It had one main street with a grocery store, a gas station, and a little diner where folks ate pancakes and pie. Everyone knew everyone. If you sneezed, someone 3 houses down would say, "Bless you," before you even finished wiping your nose. It was that kind of place. And Jake fit right in. He didn't talk much, but when he did, people listened. He had a way of making you feel calm, like everything was going to be okay. But Karen? She didn't fit in. Not one bit. She moved to town a few months ago, and from day one, she acted like she was better than everyone else. Her house was right next to Jake's farm, too close, if you ask me. It was big and white, with perfect flowers in the front yard and a shiny silver car parked out front. That car was her baby. She washed it every week, polishing it until it sparkled like a mirror. If a bird flew over and left a tiny poop on it, she'd freak out and scrub it clean in 5 seconds flat. Karen didn't like Jake's farm. Not the noise, not the dirt, not anything. She'd stand on her porch, arms crossed, glaring at him while he worked. Sometimes she'd yell over the fence, "Your tractor's too loud," or "Your chickens stink." Jake would just nod and keep going. He didn't yell back. He didn't even frown. He just kept doing his thing, quiet as always. But if you looked really close, you might see a tiny twinkle in his eye. Like he knew something Karen didn't. Like he was waiting for just the right moment. See, Jake wasn't the kind of guy who got mad fast. He was patient. Super patient. If a storm knocked over his fence, he'd fix it without complaining. If a rabbit ate his carrots, he'd shrug and plant more. But that didn't mean he was weak. Oh no. Jake was stronger than most people guessed. He could lift heavy hay bales with one arm. He could push that old tractor when it got stuck in the mud. And inside his quiet head, he was smart too. Smarter than Karen ever dreamed. Karen didn't see that, though. To her, Jake was just a nobody. A dusty guy with a rusty tractor and a messy farm. She'd walk by his place, her nose in the air, muttering things like, "This eyesore ruins my view," or "Why can't he clean up that junk?" She didn't know Jake heard her every time. He didn't say anything, but he heard. And he remembered. Every word. Every sneer. Every little jab she threw his way. The funny thing is, Karen thought she was in charge. She thought she could boss everyone around, especially Jake. She'd complain to the neighbors about him. She'd call the town office and whine about his chickens clucking too loud. Once, she even tried to get them to make a rule that said no tractors could park near her house. Can you believe that? The folks at the office just laughed and said, "Karen, it's a farm. Tractors happen." But she didn't stop. She kept pushing, thinking she'd win. And Jake? He just kept being Jake. He'd wake up, work on his farm, and tinker with his tractor. He didn't fight with her. He didn't shout. He didn't even look mad. But deep down, something was brewing. You couldn't see it yet, not on that sunny morning when the story starts. But it was there. A little spark. A tiny idea. A plan that was going to turn everything upside down. Before we go on, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? I'd love to know. Let's rewind to that morning again. The sun was up, the birds were singing, and Jake was out by the barn. He had a wrench in his hand, tightening a bolt on his tractor. The red paint gleamed a little in the sunlight, even with all its scratches. He wiped some sweat off his forehead and smiled. It was a good day. A normal day. Or so he thought. Across the fence, Karen was already awake too. She stood on her porch, sipping coffee from a fancy mug. Her hair was perfect, her clothes were perfect, and her frown? Extra perfect. She stared at Jake like he was a bug she wanted to squash. "That tractor again," she muttered. "Always making noise. Always in my way." She didn't say it loud enough for Jake to hear, not this time. But she didn't have to. Her face said it all. Jake didn't look up. He kept working, humming a little tune to himself. The birds kept chirping. The wind kept blowing. Everything seemed calm. But if you paid attention, if you really watched, you'd feel it. Something was coming. Something big. Karen thought she was the boss of everything. She thought Jake was just a quiet farmer who'd never push back. She was wrong. So wrong. That sunny morning was the start of it all. The start of a story that'd make the whole town talk. A story about a tractor, a car, and a lesson Karen would never forget. But we're not there yet. Oh no, we're just getting started. Jake's farm was quiet now, but it wouldn't stay that way. Karen's perfect life was about to get messy. And that old red tractor? It was going to be the star of the show. What happened next? How did Karen mess with Jake? And what did he do about it? You'll have to stick around to find out. Trust me, you won't believe what's coming. It's going to be wild, funny, and oh so satisfying. So grab a snack, get comfy, and let's keep going. The fun's just beginning. Karen lived right next door to Jake. Her house wasn't like his little farm at all. Oh no, it was fancy, super fancy. It was big and white, with tall windows that sparkled in the sun. The front yard had perfect green grass and bright flowers lined up in neat rows, like soldiers standing still. Out front, parked right where everyone could see it, was her big shiny car. That car was silver and so clean you could see your face in it. Karen loved that car more than anything. She'd wash it all the time, wiping off every speck of dust like it was a treasure. But Karen didn't like Jake's farm. Not one bit. She thought it was too noisy. She thought it was too smelly. She didn't like the cluck 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 of his chickens or the put 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 of his old red tractor. To her, Jake's farm was a big mess that ruined her perfect little world. Every single day, she'd find something to complain about. She'd march over to the fence that separated her fancy house from Jake's dusty farm, her arms crossed and her face all scrunched up like she'd smelled something bad. "You're ruining my peace," she'd yell, pointing her finger at Jake like she was the boss of the whole street. "That tractor is too loud. Those chickens stink. Why can't you keep this place quiet?" Her voice was sharp, like a teacher scolding a kid who forgot their homework. Jake would look up from whatever he was doing, maybe fixing his tractor or feeding the chickens, and just nod. He didn't say much. He didn't yell back. He'd just nod, wipe his hands on his jeans, and keep working. Quiet as always. But here's the thing, deep down, Jake was getting tired. Really tired. Not the kind of tired where you need a nap, but the kind where someone keeps poking you and you just want them to stop. Karen's yelling and pointing and complaining, it was starting to pile up inside him. He didn't show it, though. Not yet. His face stayed calm, his voice stayed soft, and his hands kept busy. But inside. Oh, inside, he was done with her nonsense. Karen didn't notice. She didn't care. She thought Jake was just a quiet farmer who'd never talk back. She thought she could boss him around forever. Every day, she'd find a new reason to march over and shout. One day it was the chickens. "They're too loud," she'd say, even though they were just clucking like normal chickens do. The next day it was the tractor. "That rusty thing wakes me up," she'd complain, even though Jake only used it in the afternoon. Once, she even yelled about the dirt on his boots. "You're tracking mud everywhere," she said, even though he was on his side of the fence. Jake didn't argue. He didn't say, "This is my farm, Karen," or "Go back to your house." He just nodded and kept going. If you watched him, you'd think he didn't mind. You'd think her words bounced right off him like rain on a duck's back. But if you looked closer, really, really close, you'd see something. A tiny twitch in his jaw. A little squint in his eyes. Jake wasn't mad yet, but he was getting there. Slowly. Quietly. Like a pot of water starting to bubble before it boils. The neighbors saw it all. They'd peek out their windows or sit on their porches, watching Karen stomp over and yell. They'd shake their heads and whisper to each other. "Poor Jake," they'd say. "That Karen's a handful." They felt bad for him, but they didn't step in. Why? Because Karen was loud and mean, and nobody wanted her yelling at them. So they just watched, waiting to see what would happen next. Days turned into weeks, and Karen kept going. She didn't stop. She didn't get tired. If anything, she got worse. She'd stand on her porch, sipping her fancy coffee, and glare at Jake while he worked. Sometimes she'd call her friends on the phone and talk loud enough for him to hear. "That farmer next door is such a problem," she'd say. "His stupid farm makes my life awful." Jake heard her. He didn't look up, but he heard. Every word stuck in his head like gum on a shoe. One morning, something different happened. It wasn't a big thing, not at first. Jake was out by the barn, checking his tractor like he always did. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and everything seemed normal. He climbed up on the tractor, started the engine, and let it rumble. Put put put. He smiled a little. That sound always made him happy. He was planning to drive it out to the fields and haul some hay. Just a regular day. But then Karen showed up. She didn't march over this time. Nope, she did something sneakier. She got in her shiny silver car, drove it out of her driveway, and parked it right across Jake's driveway. Right in front of his gate. Right where his tractor needed to go. She didn't ask. She didn't say anything. She just parked it there, blocking him in like a big shiny wall. Jake saw it happen. He was still on his tractor, holding the steering wheel, when her car rolled up and stopped. He blinked. He tilted his head. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at that silver car sitting there, bold as anything. Karen climbed out, slammed her door, and walked back to her porch. She didn't even look at him. She just smirked a mean little smile that said, "I win." Jake turned off the tractor. The put-put-put stopped, and everything got quiet. He climbed down, slow and steady, and walked over to the fence. He looked at her car, then at her. She was standing on her porch now, arms crossed, that smirk still on her face. "Move it," Jake called out. His voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. Clear. Like he meant it. Karen didn't move. She didn't say a word at first. She just stood there, looking at him like he was a bug she could squash. Then she laughed a sharp, nasty laugh that echoed across the yard. "Make me," she snapped. She turned around, walked inside her house, and slammed the door. Bang. Just like that, she was gone, leaving her car right where it was. Jake stood there. He didn't move. He didn't yell. He just stared at the car, then at her house, then back at the car. The sun kept shining. The birds kept chirping. But something had changed. You could feel it in the air like the calm before a big storm. Karen had gone too far. Way too far. She thought she'd won. She thought Jake would just shrug and give up, like always. Big mistake, Karen. Big, big mistake. Let's think about this for a second. Jake's driveway was his. It was part of his farm, his land. He used it every day to get his tractor in and out. Without it, he couldn't work. He couldn't haul hay or fix fences or do anything he needed to do. Karen knew that. She wasn't dumb. She parked her car there on purpose, just to mess with him. Just to show him who she thought was boss. She wanted him to feel stuck. Helpless. Like he had to beg her to move it. But Jake wasn't helpless. Not even close. He was quiet, sure. He was patient, yeah. But he wasn't weak. That car sitting there, blocking his way, it didn't make him mad right away. It didn't make him shout or stomp his feet. It made him think. You could see it in his eyes, those calm, steady eyes that didn't miss a thing. He was thinking hard. Planning something. What? Nobody knew yet. Not Karen, not the neighbors, not even the birds watching from the trees. Karen didn't care. She was inside her house now, probably sipping more coffee, smiling to herself. She thought she'd beat him. She thought Jake would knock on her door, hat in hand, and say, "Please, Karen, move your car." She thought he'd bow down to her like she was a queen. Oh, how wrong she was. She didn't know Jake at all. She didn't know what he could do or what that old red tractor could do. The neighbors saw it too. A few of them were outside now, pretending to water their flowers or walk their dogs. They glanced at Jake, then at Karen's car, then back at Jake. "What's he gonna do?" one whispered. "She's asking for trouble," another said. They didn't know what was coming, but they could feel it. Something was brewing. Something big. Jake walked back to his tractor. He didn't rush. He didn't look worried. He climbed up, sat down, and rested his hands on the wheel. He looked at the car again, shiny and silver, parked right where it didn't belong. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The way he sat there, calm and still, said everything. Karen had pushed him too far. She'd crossed a line. And now? Now Jake wasn't just tired of her nonsense. He was done. What would he do? Would he call someone for help? Would he try to push the car himself? Or would he just sit there and wait? Nobody knew. Not yet. But one thing was clear, Karen's little game was about to backfire. She thought she was smart. She thought she was in charge. She had no idea what Jake was capable of. That smirk on her face? It wasn't going to last long. Big mistake, Karen. Big, giant, huge mistake. Jake sat on his tractor, staring at Karen's shiny silver car. It was still parked right across his driveway, blocking his way like a big, mean wall. The sun was high now, shining down on the farm, making everything look bright and hot. The birds were quieter, like they were waiting to see what would happen. The neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, pretending they weren't watching. But they were. Everyone was. Karen was inside her fancy house. She didn't come back out. She didn't check on her car. She probably thought Jake was stomping around, mad as a hornet, trying to figure out what to do. She probably thought he'd give up and leave her alone. She was so sure of herself, so sure she'd won this little fight. But Jake wasn't stomping. He wasn't mad, at least, not on the outside. He was just sitting there, hands on the tractor wheel, thinking. Thinking hard. He climbed down from the tractor again. His boots hit the dirt with a soft thump. He walked over to the fence, real slow, and leaned against it. He looked at Karen's car, its shiny bumper, its clean windows, its perfect tires. Then he looked at her house. The curtains didn't move. She wasn't watching him. Good. That gave him time. Time to figure out his next step. Jake wasn't the kind of guy who acted fast. He didn't jump into things without a plan. That's what made him different from Karen. She was all loud and quick, yelling and pointing like she owned the world. Jake was slow and steady, like a river carving a path through a mountain. You didn't see it happen, but one day bam, there was a big canyon where flat land used to be. That's how Jake worked. Quiet. Smart. Patient. He walked back to the barn. His steps were calm, like he was just taking a stroll. He didn't look worried. He didn't look scared. But inside his head, wheels were turning. Ideas were popping. Karen thought she'd trapped him by blocking his driveway. She thought she'd made him helpless. She didn't know Jake had a trick up his sleeve, or maybe a few tricks. She didn't know that old red tractor wasn't just for hauling hay. It was more than that. A lot more. Inside the barn, Jake grabbed a rope. It was thick and strong, the kind he used to tie down big loads. He held it in his hands, running his fingers over it, like he was testing it. He didn't smile, but his eyes had that twinkle again, that little spark that said he was up to something. He tossed the rope over his shoulder and walked back outside. The sun was hotter now, and sweat dripped down his face. He wiped it off with his sleeve and kept going. Back at the tractor, he stopped and looked at Karen's car again. It hadn't moved. Of course it hadn't. She wasn't going to move it. She'd left it there to teach him a lesson, to show him who was boss. Make me, she'd said. Those words bounced around in Jake's head. Make me. Okay, Karen. Maybe he would. He climbed back onto the tractor and started the engine. Put put put. That sound filled the air again, steady and loud. The neighbors perked up. One old man watering his garden turned off the hose and watched. A lady walking her dog stopped and stared. They could feel it. Something was about to happen. Jake wasn't just sitting there anymore. He was doing something. But what? Karen's house stayed quiet. No sound. No movement. She didn't know what was going on outside. She didn't hear the tractor rumbling. She didn't see Jake tying that rope to the back of it, looping it tight and strong. She didn't see him climb down and walk toward her car, rope in hand, his face calm but his eyes sharp. She had no idea. Jake stopped right next to her car. He bent down and looked under it, like he was checking something. He tapped the bumper with his knuckles, tap, tap, and nodded to himself. Then he took the rope and started wrapping it around the bumper. Slow. Careful. He didn't rush. He made sure it was tight, pulling hard to test it. The rope held. Good. He stood up and looked at the tractor, then at the car, then back at the tractor. He was measuring something in his head, distance, maybe, or strength. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His hands did the talking, moving fast now, tying the other end of the rope to the tractor. He pulled it tight again, making sure it wouldn't slip. It didn't. Everything was set. The neighbors were whispering now. What's he doing? The old man asked. Is he gonna pull it? The lady with the dog said. They didn't know for sure, but they couldn't look away. Jake climbed back onto the tractor and sat down. He put his hands on the wheel and took a deep breath. The engine was still running, rumbling like a big, sleepy bear. Put put put. He looked at Karen's car one more time, then at her house. Still no sign of her. Perfect. He shifted the tractor into gear. The engine growled a little louder. The wheels turned just a tiny bit at first, testing the rope. It went tight, stretching between the tractor and the car. Jake stopped. He looked back, checking the rope again. It was holding. He nodded to himself. This could work. This could really work. Inside her house, Karen was probably laughing. She probably thought Jake was pacing around, mad and helpless, stuck behind her car. She probably thought she'd outsmarted him, that she'd won this little war. She didn't hear the tractor. She didn't see the rope. She didn't know Jake was about to turn her perfect plan upside down. The tension was thick now. You could feel it like the air before a thunderstorm, heavy and buzzing. Jake wasn't yelling. He wasn't fighting. He was just sitting there, ready to move. Ready to do something big. Karen had pushed him too far. She'd blocked his driveway. She'd smirked and said, "Make me." And now? Now Jake was going to. Not with words. Not with shouts. With action. The neighbors held their breath. The old man dropped his hose. The lady's dog sat down and tilted its head. They all watched Jake, waiting. What would happen next? Would the rope break? Would the car move? Would Karen come running out, screaming her head off? Nobody knew. But one thing was for sure, this wasn't over. Not even close. Jake's hand hovered over the gear shift. He didn't move it yet. He just sat there, letting the tractor rumble, letting the moment build. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to be. Karen had made her move. Now it was his turn. And when Jake made a move, it wasn't loud or flashy. It was smart. It was strong. It was something you'd never forget. "Make me," she'd said. Those words echoed in his mind again. He looked at the car, tied to his tractor with that thick rope. He looked at the driveway, blocked for no good reason. He looked at her house, so quiet and smug. And then, just for a second, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not a big smile, just a tiny one. A hint. A clue. Jake had a plan. A good one. The tractor's engine kept going. Put put put. The rope stayed tight. The car sat there, shiny and stuck. Karen stayed inside, clueless. And Jake? Jake was ready. Ready to show her what happens when you mess with the wrong farmer. Ready to teach her a lesson she'd never see coming. Ready to make her wish she'd never parked that car in his way. Big mistake, Karen. Huge mistake. The tension was about to break. And when it did. Oh, it was going to be good. Jake stood there in the bright sun, scratching his head. Karen's shiny silver car was parked right across his driveway, blocking his old red tractor inside. He stared at it, tilting his head a little, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. That car wasn't moving, not yet. Karen had put it there on purpose, smirking from her porch like she'd won a big prize. "Make me," she'd said, and then she'd gone inside her fancy house, slamming the door. She thought she'd beat him. She thought Jake would just give up. He could have called the cops. That would have been easy. He could have picked up his phone, dialed the number, and said, "Hey, someone's blocking my driveway." The police would come, lights flashing, and tell Karen to move her car. Or he could have yelled back at her. He could have shouted, "Get that car out of my way, Karen," loud enough for the whole town to hear. But Jake? He didn't do easy stuff like that. He was smarter than that. Way smarter. Instead, he turned around and looked at his tractor. It was sitting there by the barn, red and scratched up, with bits of mud stuck to its big tires. He walked over to it, slow and steady, his boots kicking up little puffs of dust. He climbed up onto the seat, grabbed the key, and turned it. The engine started with a loud put-put-put. It rumbled and shook, like a big dog waking up from a nap. Jake patted the steering wheel, like he was saying, "Hey, old buddy, we've got work to do." Across the fence, Karen stepped back out onto her porch. She'd heard the noise. She stood there with her fancy coffee mug in her hand, watching Jake. When she saw him sitting on the tractor, she laughed, a sharp, mean laugh that cut through the air. "What are you gonna do with that junk?" she called out, her voice dripping with sass. She thought she'd won. She thought Jake was just making noise, trying to look tough. She didn't know he had a plan brewing. A good one. See, that tractor wasn't just old. It wasn't just some rusty thing Jake liked to fix. It was strong, really strong. Strong enough to pull heavy hay bales across the field. Strong enough to drag logs out of the woods. Strong enough to move more than Karen could ever guess. She didn't know that. She didn't think about it. To her, it was just a loud, ugly machine that messed up her quiet mornings. Oh, how wrong she was. Jake didn't answer her. He didn't even look at her. He just sat there, letting the tractor rumble, his hands resting on the wheel. His face was calm, but his mind was busy. He was thinking. Planning. figuring out his next step. Karen didn't scare him. Her laugh didn't bother him. He'd heard worse from her before, all her yelling about his chickens and his dirt and his noise. This was just another day of Karen being Karen. But today was different. Today, Jake wasn't going to just nod and keep working. He climbed down from the tractor and walked to the back of it. There was a big hook there, a strong metal thing he used to pull stuff. He bent down and grabbed a chain from the ground. It was heavy, with big links that clinked together when he moved it. He held it up, looking at it, like he was checking to see if it was good enough. It was. He smiled, just a tiny smile, so small you'd miss it if you blinked. Then he started hooking the chain to the tractor, nice and slow, like he was setting up for a regular chore. Karen didn't even blink. She was still on her porch, sipping her coffee, watching him with that smirk on her face. She didn't think anything of it. To her, Jake was just playing around, wasting time. "Good luck with that," she shouted, laughing again. She turned around and leaned against her porch railing, acting like she didn't care. She was too busy feeling smart, thinking she'd outsmarted him. She had no idea what was coming. Jake kept working. He looped the chain around the hook and pulled it tight. Clank. It locked into place. He tugged on it with his hands, making sure it wouldn't slip. It didn't. The chain was strong, just like the tractor. He stood up and wiped his hands on his jeans, leaving little black streaks of dirt. Then he walked over to the fence, real slow, and looked at Karen's car again. It was still there, shiny and silver, sitting right where it didn't belong. He bent down and peeked under the car. He squinted, like he was looking for something. Maybe a spot to hook the chain. Maybe a way to move it. He tapped the bumper with his fingers, tap, tap, and nodded to himself. Yup, this could work. He stood up and dragged the chain over, letting it trail behind him in the dirt. The end of it clinked against the ground, making a little noise. He stopped right next to the car and looked at it again. Up close, it was even shinier. Karen loved that car. She'd freak out if it got a scratch. Jake knew that. And maybe, just maybe, that was part of his plan. He wrapped the chain around the car's bumper, slow and careful. He didn't want to mess it up, not yet. He pulled the chain tight, tying it in a knot that wouldn't budge. He tugged on it again, testing it. The chain held. The car didn't move. Not yet. Jake stepped back and looked at his work. The chain stretched from the tractor to the car, like a long, strong rope tying them together. He nodded again. Everything was ready. Karen was still on her porch, sipping her coffee like nothing was happening. She didn't see the chain. She didn't hear the little clinks as Jake hooked it up. She was too busy thinking she'd won, too busy feeling proud of herself. She didn't know Jake was one step ahead. She didn't know that tractor was about to change everything. The neighbors were watching now. Not just peeking, they were standing outside, staring. The old man with the garden hose had turned off the water and leaned against his fence. The lady with the dog had stopped walking and sat on her steps. A couple of kids riding bikes slowed down and pointed. "What's he doing?" one of them whispered. "Is he gonna pull her car?" another asked. They didn't know, but they wanted to find out. Jake climbed back onto the tractor. He sat down and put his hands on the wheel. The engine was still running, put-put-put, steady and loud. He looked at the chain, then at the car, then at Karen on her porch. She wasn't laughing anymore. She was watching him now, her coffee mug halfway to her mouth, her eyes squinting. She still didn't get it. She still thought he was bluffing. "Go ahead and try," she called out, her voice sharp but a little shaky. She didn't sound so sure anymore. Jake didn't say anything. He just shifted the tractor into gear. The engine growled a little louder. The wheels turned just a tiny bit and the chain went tight. It stretched hard between the tractor and the car, pulling like a tug-of-war rope. The car didn't move yet, but the bumper creaked a little. Creak. A tiny sound, but it was there. Jake stopped. He looked back, checking the chain. It was still good. He hadn't pulled hard, not yet. He was just testing it. Karen's smirk faded. She put her coffee mug down on the porch railing and stepped forward. "What are you doing?" she shouted, her voice higher now, like she was starting to worry. She still didn't think he'd do it. She still thought he'd back off. But that creak, that little noise from her precious car made her blink. She wasn't so sure anymore. Jake turned the tractor off. The put-put-put stopped, and everything got quiet. He climbed down and walked over to the car again. He bent down and looked at the bumper, running his hand over it. No scratches, not yet. He stood up and looked at Karen. She was staring at him, her mouth open a little, like she couldn't believe what she'd just seen. "You better not touch my car," she yelled, pointing her finger again. But her voice wasn't as strong. It wobbled, just a tiny bit. Jake didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just walked back to the tractor, calm as ever, and climbed up again. He started the engine put-put-put and let it rumble. He didn't pull yet. He just sat there, letting the sound fill the air, letting Karen wonder. Letting her sweat. The chain stayed tight, ready to go. The car stayed still, but not for long. The neighbors were buzzing now. "He's really gonna do it," the old man said, his eyes wide. "He's gonna move her car," the lady with the dog whispered. The kids on bikes giggled and pointed. "This is gonna be awesome," one of them said. They could feel it, something big was coming. Jake wasn't joking around. He wasn't giving up. He was building up to something, step by step, nice and slow. Karen stepped off her porch now. She walked a few steps toward the fence, her hands on her hips. "You stop that right now," she shouted. "You'll ruin my car. I'll call the cops." Her voice was loud, but it had a squeak in it, like she was scared, even if she didn't want to show it. She didn't like this. She didn't like that chain. She didn't like that tractor rumbling like it was ready to pounce. Jake looked at her. Just for a second. His face didn't change, no smile, no frown, just calm. Then he looked back at the car. He put his hand on the gear shift again. He didn't pull yet. He was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for Karen to realize she'd messed with the wrong guy. That tractor wasn't just strong, it was his secret weapon. And Karen? She was about to find that out. Days of her yelling flashed through Jake's head. All her complaints about his noise, his chickens, his dirt. All her sneers and smirks and mean words. And now this, her car blocking his driveway, her make me ringing in his ears. He'd been patient. He'd been quiet. But every push from her had built up to this. Every little jab had led him here, to this moment, with a chain and a tractor and a plan. Karen didn't see it yet. She didn't get it. She thought she could still win. She thought Jake would back down, like always. But that creak from her car, that tiny sound, told her something different. It told her Jake wasn't playing. It told her he was serious. And deep down, she was starting to wonder, what if he really did it? What if he moved her car? What if she'd pushed him too far? The tractor kept rumbling. The chain stayed tight. The neighbors kept watching. And Jake? He sat there, ready. Ready to show her. Ready to reveal what that old red tractor could do. Karen had laughed. She'd smirked. She'd thought she'd won. Oh, how wrong she was. So wrong. The sun was high in the sky now, shining down on Jake's little farm. His old red tractor sat there, rumbling loud with its put-put-put. The chain was hooked tight, looped from the back of the tractor to the bumper of Karen's shiny silver car. That car was still parked across Jake's driveway, blocking his way, just like Karen wanted. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, thinking she'd won. She didn't know what was coming. Not yet. Jake sat on the tractor, his hands on the wheel. He'd been calm all day, quiet, slow, like he always was. But now something was different. His eyes had a spark. His jaw was set. He was done waiting. He reached down and shifted gears. The tractor roared louder, rumble, 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 like a big beast waking up. The sound shook the air, bouncing off the barn and the trees. Karen looked up from her porch, her coffee mug halfway to her mouth. She frowned. "What's he doing now?" she muttered. Jake didn't look at her. He didn't need to. He tugged the chain with his hand one more time, making sure it was tight. It was. The metal links gleamed in the sun, strong and ready. He'd looped it around Karen's car bumper earlier, nice and slow, like he was tying a shoe. Now it was time to see if his plan would work. He took a deep breath, gripped the wheel, and pushed the pedal down. The tractor lurched forward just a little at first. The chain went tight, pulling hard against the car. And then boom, it happened. The car started sliding. The tires squealed against the gravel, making a loud squeak that echoed across the farm. Dust flew up in clouds as Jake dragged that shiny silver car right off his driveway. The bumper creaked, the wheels scraped, and the whole thing moved slow at first, then faster. Jake didn't stop. He kept going, pulling it onto the street like it was nothing. Karen's jaw dropped. Her coffee mug slipped from her hand and smashed on the porch, crash, spilling brown liquid all over her perfect wood floor. "Stop that," she screamed, her voice high and wild. She ran off the porch, her fancy shoe slipping as she raced toward the fence. "Stop it right now," she yelled again, waving her arms like a crazy bird. But it was too late. Way too late. Jake didn't even flinch. He kept driving the tractor, slow and steady, dragging her car along. The tires bumped over the gravel, then rolled onto the soft grass of Karen's lawn. He turned the wheel just right, parking that shiny car neatly in her front yard right where everyone could see it. The engine growled one last time, then went quiet as he turned it off. Put put, put, silence. He climbed down, unhooked the chain from the bumper, and let it drop to the ground with a soft clank. Then he looked at Karen, tipped his hat, and said, "You said to make you." His voice was cool as ice, calm as a summer breeze. Karen froze. Her face turned red, redder than a tomato, redder than a fire truck, redder than anything you'd ever seen. Her mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water, but no words came out. She just stood there, staring at her car, her precious, shiny car sitting on her lawn, a little dusty now, with tire marks behind it. She couldn't believe it. She wouldn't believe it. But there it was, plain as day. The neighbors peeked out their windows, chuckling. The old man with the garden hose laughed so hard he had to sit down. The lady with the dog covered her mouth, giggling behind her hand. The kids on bikes cheered and clapped, like they'd just seen the best show ever. "He did it," one shouted. "He really moved her car," another yelled. They weren't quiet about it anymore, they were loud, happy, amazed. Jake had done something big, and they loved it. Karen spun around, glaring at them. "What are you laughing at?" she snapped, her voice shaking. She pointed at Jake, her finger wobbling. You can't do that. That's my car. I'll call the police. I'll sue you. You'll be sorry." She was yelling so loud her voice cracked, but nobody cared. Not the neighbors, not the kids, not Jake. They'd all seen what happened. They knew who'd won. Jake didn't argue. He didn't shout back. He just stood there by his tractor, brushing dirt off his hands. He looked at Karen, then at her car, then back at her. "It's off my driveway," he said, simple as that. He didn't need to say more. The car wasn't blocking him anymore. He'd fixed the problem his way. And that tip of his hat? That was him saying, "Game over, Karen." She stomped her foot, hard enough to shake the ground. "This isn't over," she screeched, her face still red. She ran back to her house, slamming the door so loud it rattled the windows. Bang. Inside, you could hear her yelling, probably grabbing her phone to call someone, cops, a lawyer, her friends, anyone who'd listen. But out here, it was quiet again. Just the birds chirping, the wind blowing, and the neighbors whispering. Jake walked over to the car one more time. He bent down and checked the bumper. There was a tiny scratch, not big, just a little mark where the chain had tugged. He ran his finger over it, then shrugged. It wasn't his car. It wasn't his problem. He picked up the chain, coiled it up, and carried it back to the barn. The tractor sat there, red and proud, like it knew it'd done a good job. Jake patted it again, like he was saying, "Thanks, buddy." The neighbors couldn't stop talking. They came out of their houses now, gathering in little groups. "Did you see that?" the old man said, still laughing. "He pulled it like it was a toy." The lady with the dog nodded. "She deserved it," she said. "Blocking his driveway like that? Who does she think she is?" The kids rode their bikes closer, grinning. "That was so cool," one shouted. "Can you do it again?" another asked. Jake just smiled a small, quiet smile and waved at them. Karen's car sat on her lawn, looking a little less shiny now. The dust from the gravel had settled on it, and those tire marks stretched all the way from Jake's driveway to her yard. Every time she looked out her window, she'd see it. Every time she walked outside, she'd remember. She'd messed with the wrong farmer. She'd thought Jake was just a quiet guy who'd never fight back. She'd thought her fancy car and loud voice made her the boss. Nope. Not today. Inside her house, Karen was probably screaming into her phone. He dragged my car. With a tractor. On my lawn, she'd say. But out here, nobody felt bad for her. Not one bit. She'd been yelling at Jake for months about his tractor, his chickens, his dirt. She'd been mean and bossy, thinking she could push him around. And now she'd learned something. Jake wasn't weak. He wasn't helpless. He was smart. He was strong. And that old red tractor? It was tougher than she'd ever dreamed. The big reveal wasn't just the car moving. It was Jake showing who he really was. All this time, Karen had laughed at him. She'd called him a dusty nobody. She'd thought he'd never stand up to her. But when he climbed on that tractor, hooked up that chain, and pulled her car away, boom, that was the truth coming out. Jake wasn't just a farmer. He was a guy who didn't need to yell or fight. He just did what he had to do, and he did it better than she could have imagined. The neighbors kept chuckling. They'd tell this story for weeks, maybe months. Remember when Jake moved Karen's car, they'd say, laughing over coffee or pie at the diner. She never saw it coming. And Karen? She'd hear them. She'd know they were talking about her. Her face would turn red all over again, but she couldn't change it. It was done. Jake had won. He walked back to his tractor now, climbing up one more time. He started the engine, put put put, and drove it out of the barn, past the driveway, and into the field. No more car blocking his way. No more Karen stopping him. He had work to do, hay to haul, crops to check, and he did it like nothing had happened. Cool as ice. Calm as ever. Karen peeked out her window, her phone pressed to her ear. She saw the tractor rolling away, saw her car sitting on her lawn, saw the neighbors still giggling. Her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed tight. She was mad, madder than mad. But deep down, she knew. She'd lost this round. She'd messed with Jake, and Jake had messed back without raising his voice, without breaking a sweat. The climax was over. The big reveal was done. Jake wasn't just the quiet farmer anymore. He was the guy who moved a car with a tractor. He was the guy who shut Karen up without saying much at all. And that moment, that loud squeak of tires, that boom of action, it was something nobody would forget. Especially not Karen. She'd messed with the wrong farmer, and now she knew it. Jake sat back on his tractor, rolling it into the field like nothing big had just happened. The put-put-put of the engine faded as he moved away, leaving Karen's shiny silver car parked on her own lawn. The tire marks stretched across the grass, a dusty trail from his driveway to her yard. The chain lay coiled by the barn, quiet now, its job done. The sun kept shining, the birds started chirping again, and everything seemed calm. But oh, it wasn't calm for Karen. Not one bit. She stood at her window, her phone still pressed to her ear, staring out at her car. Her face was still red, bright, blazing red, like she'd been sitting in the sun too long. Her eyes were wide, her mouth tight, and her hands shook a little. Yes, hello, she shouted into the phone. I need the police. My neighbor, he dragged my car with a tractor. Yes, a tractor. It's on my lawn right now. Her voice was loud, squeaky, almost like she was about to cry. But nobody outside cared. Nobody felt sorry for her. The neighbors were still buzzing. They couldn't stop talking about what they'd just seen. The old man with the garden hose walked over to the lady with the dog, his eyes twinkling. I've lived here 30 years, he said, and I've never seen anything like that. Jake's a quiet one, but boy, he's got guts. The lady nodded, petting her little dog. Karen's been asking for it, she said. Yelling at him all the time, parking her car there, she thought he'd just take it. Nope. They both laughed, loud and happy, like they'd been waiting for this day. The kids on bikes rode up closer to Jake's fence, their wheels kicking up dust. That was the coolest thing ever, one shouted, a boy with a red cap. He pulled her car like it was a toy, said another, a girl with pigtails. They dropped their bikes and ran to the edge of the yard, peering at the tractor in the field. Jake was far off now, hauling hay bales, but they waved anyway. "You're awesome, Jake," they yelled. He didn't hear them, not over the tractor's rumble, but he didn't need to. Everyone knew how they felt. Back at her house, Karen slammed the phone down. She'd called the police, but they hadn't come yet. She stomped to the door and threw it open, bang, stepping onto her porch again. Her coffee mug was still broken on the floor, little brown drops drying in the sun. She didn't care about that now. She cared about her car. Her precious, shiny car. She marched down the steps, her shoes clicking on the wood, and stopped right in front of it. She bent down, looking at the bumper, her hands on her hips. There it was, a tiny scratch. Just a little mark where the chain had pulled. It wasn't big, not like a dent or a smashed window, but it was there. To Karen, it was everything. "My car," she wailed, her voice loud enough to scare the birds away. "He scratched my car. My beautiful car." She ran her finger over the mark, like she could wipe it away, but it stayed. She stood up, spinning around to glare at Jake's farm. "You'll pay for this," she shouted, even though he was too far to hear. Jake kept working. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He'd moved her car, cleared his driveway, and now he was back to his day, hauling hay, checking crops, doing what he always did. The tractor rumbled along, steady and strong, like it hadn't just started in the biggest show in town. Jake's face was calm, his hands steady on the wheel. "That little tip of his hat? That you said to make you?" That was all he needed to say. He'd done it. He'd won. Karen didn't see it that way. Oh no. She saw it as a war she was going to keep fighting. She ran back inside, grabbed her phone again, and started dialing. "Hello? Yes, I need a tow truck. Right now. My car's stuck on my lawn," she yelled. She paced back and forth, her voice bouncing off the walls. "And after that, I'm calling my lawyer. That farmer thinks he can mess with me. He's wrong. He's so wrong." She kept talking, fast and furious, like she could undo what had happened. Outside, the neighbors watched her storm around. They didn't laugh out loud anymore, not with her so close, but their eyes sparkled. They whispered to each other, grinning behind their hands. "She's mad now," the old man said. "Madder than a wet cat." The lady with the dog nodded. "She should have moved her car when he asked," she said. "None of this would have happened." They both shook their heads, still amazed at Jake's big move. The kids weren't whispering. They were loud and excited, running around Jake's fence. "Do it again, Jake," the boy in the red cap shouted, even though Jake couldn't hear. "Yeah, pull something else," the girl with pigtails added. They picked up sticks and pretended they were tractors, dragging them through the dirt, making vroom vroom noises. "I'm Jake," the boy said. "And I'm moving Karen's car," the girl giggled. They played like that for a while, turning the whole thing into a game. Karen heard them. She peeked out her window again, her face twisting when she saw the kids laughing and playing. "Little brats," she muttered. She didn't like that they were on Jake's side. She didn't like that everyone was. She slammed her window shut thud and kept pacing, waiting for the tow truck, waiting for the police, waiting for someone to fix this. But out here, nobody was on her team. Not today. Jake finished hauling his hay. He drove the tractor back toward the barn, slow and easy, like he always did. The sun was lower now, turning the sky orange and pink. He parked the tractor inside, turned off the engine, and climbed down. He stretched his arms, wiped sweat off his forehead, and looked around. His driveway was clear. His farm was peaceful. Karen's car was gone from his land. Everything was right again. He walked over to where the chain lay, picking it up and coiling it neat. He carried it into the barn and hung it on a hook, right where it belonged. Then he stepped outside and looked at Karen's house. She was still inside, probably yelling into her phone. Her car sat on her lawn, a little dusty, a little scratched, a big reminder of what had happened. Jake didn't smile, not big, anyway. But that tiny twitch at the corner of his mouth was back. Just for a second. The police finally showed up. A car rolled down the street, lights off, no siren, just a slow drive up to Karen's house. 2 officers climbed out, one tall and one short, both looking tired. Karen burst out her door before they could knock. "There he is," she shouted, pointing at Jake across the fence. "He dragged my car. With a tractor. Look at it, it's ruined." She waved her hands, her voice loud and fast, like she was telling the biggest story ever. The officers walked over to her car. They bent down, looked at the bumper, then at the tire marks. The tall one scratched his head. "It's not ruined," he said. "Just a scratch." The short one nodded. "And it's on your lawn, not his driveway." They turned to Jake, who was standing by his barn, watching quiet as always. "This your land?" the tall one asked, pointing to the driveway. "Yup," Jake said, simple and clear. "She parked there. I asked her to move it. She said make me. So I did." The officers looked at each other. The short one's mouth twitched, like he was trying not to laugh. "Well, it's not blocking you now," he said. They turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, this is your car on your property. He didn't steal it. He didn't break it. Looks like he just moved it." The tall one shrugged. "Not much we can do." Karen's face went red again, redder than before, if that was possible. "What?" she screeched. "He can't do that. It's my car. He scratched it." She stomped her foot, but the officers didn't budge. "Take it up with a lawyer if you want," the short one said. "But this isn't a crime." They tipped their hats, walked back to their car, and drove off, leaving Karen standing there, fuming. The tow truck came next. A big yellow truck rolled up, and a man in greasy overalls climbed out. He looked at the car, then at Karen. "You want it moved?" he asked. "Yes," she snapped. "Get it back in my driveway where it belongs." The man hooked it up, dragged it off the lawn, and parked it neat in her driveway. "That'll be $50, he said. Karen's eyes went wide. $50, she yelled, but she paid him, muttering the whole time. Jake watched from his porch now, sipping a glass of water. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The car was moved. The police were gone. The neighbors were still chuckling. And Karen? She'd learned something big. She'd messed with the wrong farmer. That tractor wasn't just old, it was strong. That quiet guy wasn't just quiet, he was clever. And that make me? It was the last thing she should have said. The big reveal was complete. Jake had shown everyone who he really was. Not just a farmer. Not just a quiet guy. A hero with a tractor and a plan. And Karen? She'd never forget it. Karen stood on her lawn, staring at her shiny silver car. It was back in her driveway now, thanks to the tow truck guy, but she was still mad, really, really mad. Her face was red, her hands were clenched into fists, and she stomped her foot so hard you'd think the ground would crack. "This isn't over," she shouted, her voice loud enough to bounce off the houses nearby. She spun around and stormed off, marching back into her fancy white house. The door slammed behind her bang and you could hear her muttering inside. "Lawyers. Lawsuits. He'll be sorry," she kept saying, over and over, like she was planning a big fight. But here's the thing, Karen didn't have a case. Not even a little one. Jake's driveway was his land. It belonged to him, just like his farm and his old red tractor. He could do what he wanted on it, as long as it wasn't mean or wrong. And Karen's car? Well, she shouldn't have parked it there. She'd blocked him in, right where he needed to go, and she'd smirked and said, "Make me." So Jake did. He moved it fair and square. The police had said so. The neighbors had seen it. Even the tow truck guy didn't care. Karen could yell about lawyers all she wanted, but she wasn't going to win. Inside her house, she grabbed her phone again. She dialed numbers, fast and furious, her fingers tapping like crazy. "Hello? Yes, I need a lawyer," she said, her voice sharp. "My neighbor dragged my car with a tractor." "Yes, a tractor. It's scratched now, and he thinks he can get away with it." She paced back and forth, her shoes clicking on her shiny floor. She talked for a long time, huffing and puffing, telling her story like she was the big victim. But the person on the phone, some lawyer, probably just listened and said, and okay, and not much else. Karen didn't like that. She wanted them to yell too. She wanted them to promise she'd win. But they didn't. Outside, the sun was setting. The sky turned orange and purple, and the air got cool. Jake sat on his porch, sipping water from a glass, watching the day end. His tractor was parked in the barn, quiet now, its job done. The chain was hung up, neat and tidy. His driveway was clear, no silver car, no nothing. Everything was back to normal on his little farm. He leaned back in his chair, his boots up on the railing, and took a deep breath. He didn't look mad. He didn't look worried. He just looked Jake. Calm and steady, like always. The next morning, something big happened. A tow truck rolled into town again, not the same one from yesterday, but a different one, bigger and louder. It stopped right in front of Karen's house. The driver climbed out, a guy with a beard and a baseball cap, and knocked on her door. Knock, knock. Karen opened it fast, like she'd been waiting. "You here for my car?" she asked, her voice still grumpy. "Yup," the guy said. "Got a call to take it away." Karen nodded, arms crossed. "Good. Get it out of here. I don't want to see it anymore." The tow truck guy hooked up her car, her shiny, scratched up silver car, and pulled it onto the back of his truck. The engine roared, the chains clanked, and just like that, the car was gone. It rolled down the street, out of sight, off to who knows where. Maybe a repair shop. Maybe a junkyard. Nobody knew, and nobody asked. But one thing was clear, Karen's car wasn't coming back anytime soon. She'd had it hauled away for good. Jake saw it happen. He was out by the barn, feeding his chickens, when the tow truck drove by. He looked up, watched it go, then went back to his work. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. His driveway was still clear, his farm was still his, and Karen's big plan to mess with him. It was gone, just like her car. He tossed some corn to the chickens, cluck cluck cluck, and kept going with his day. Word spread around town fast. Really fast. By lunchtime, everyone knew what had happened. The old man with the garden hose told his buddies at the diner. "Jake moved her car with his tractor," he said, laughing over his coffee. "Dragged it right onto her lawn." The lady with the dog told her friends at the store. She yelled and yelled, but he just tipped his hat and said, "You told me to," she said, grinning. The kids on bikes rode around, shouting it to anyone who'd listen. "Jake's the coolest. He beat Karen with a tractor," they cheered. Suddenly, Jake wasn't just the quiet farmer anymore. Oh no. He was the guy who stood up to Karen. The guy who didn't yell or fight but still won. People started looking at him different. When he walked down the street to get some nails at the hardware store, folks waved at him, big smiles on their faces. "Nice one, Jake," they'd say, giving him a thumbs up. "Way to go," others called out. Even the lady at the store cash register winked and said, "Heard about your tractor trick. Good for you." Jake just nodded, like always, but you could tell he liked it just a little. Even the sheriff heard about it. He drove by Jake's farm that afternoon, his big black truck rumbling slow. He stopped at the fence, climbed out, and leaned against it. Jake was fixing a gate nearby, hammer in hand. The sheriff, tall, with a mustache and a shiny badge, watched him for a second, then laughed. A big, deep laugh. "Heard you moved a car yesterday," he said, tipping his hat. "With that old tractor of yours. That true?" Jake looked up, wiped sweat off his forehead, and nodded. "Yup," he said. "She parked it in my way. I moved it." The sheriff laughed again, shaking his head. "Well, I'll be," he said. "That's one way to handle it. She called us, you know, screaming about lawsuits and all that. But your land's your land. She can't block it like that." He patted the fence, still chuckling. "Nice work, Jake. Real nice." Then he tipped his hat again, got back in his truck, and drove off, still smiling. Even the sheriff thought Jake was a hero. Karen. She stayed quiet after that. Really quiet. No more marching over to yell about the tractor. No more shouting about the chickens. No more pointing her finger like she owned the street. She stayed inside her fancy house, curtains closed, door shut. Sometimes you'd see her peek out, just a little, her eyes narrow and grumpy. But she didn't come out. She didn't say a word. Her car was gone, Her big plan had flopped, and everyone in town was talking about Jake, not her. The neighbors noticed it too. "She's not yelling anymore," the old man said one day, watering his flowers. "First time in months it's been this quiet." The lady with the dog agreed. "Maybe she's finally learned," she said, tossing a ball for her pup. "You don't mess with Jake." They both nodded, happy to have peace again. The kids on bikes rode by her house sometimes, giggling and whispering, but Karen didn't even open her window. She'd learned her lesson the hard way. Days turned into weeks, and things settled down. Jake kept working on his farm, same as always. He'd wake up early, feed the chickens, haul hay with his tractor, and sit on his porch at night. The put-put-put of the tractor became a normal sound again, not a weapon, just a tool. His crops grew tall, his barn stayed neat, and his driveway stayed clear. Life was good. People didn't forget, though. Every now and then, someone would bring it up. "Hey, Jake, remember when you moved Karen's car?" they'd say, grinning. He'd just nod and say, "Yup," with that tiny twitch of a smile. It became a story, a big, fun story that folks told over and over. At the diner, at the store, at school, even the kids started drawing pictures of it. Jake on his red tractor, pulling a silver car, with Karen waving her arms in the background. Karen heard them talking. She couldn't help it. The town was small, and voices carried. She'd sit in her house, sipping her fancy coffee, and hear the whispers through her windows. "Jake's the man," they'd say. Karen picked the wrong guy. It made her mad, so mad, but she couldn't do anything about it. Her car was gone. Her yelling hadn't worked. And now everyone loved Jake more than ever. One day, a little sign went up in Jake's yard. It wasn't big, just a piece of wood with some paint. The kids had made it, with help from the old man. It said, "Tractor Hero," in big, wobbly letters. They stuck it by his fence, giggling as they ran off. Jake saw it when he came out to check his crops. He stopped, looked at it, and scratched his head. Then he smiled, a real smile this time, not just a twitch. He didn't take it down. He left it there, right where everyone could see. Karen saw it too. She peeked out her window, her lips pressed tight. "Tractor Hero," she muttered, rolling her eyes. But she didn't say more. She didn't march over to complain. She just closed her curtains and stayed inside. She knew she'd lost not just the fight, but the whole town. They were Team Jake now, and she couldn't change that. Justice was served. Not with a big fight or a loud argument, but with a tractor and a chain and a quiet guy who'd had enough. Karen's car was gone, her yelling was done, and Jake was the hero. She'd pushed him too far, and he'd pushed back, smart and strong and cool as ice. She'd learned her lesson the hard way, and the town would never let her forget it. Jake didn't brag. He didn't need to. He just kept being Jake, quiet, kind, hard-working. But now, when people waved or smiled or said, "Nice one, Jake," he knew why. He'd stood up for himself, and it felt good. Real good. And that's how it goes, friends. Jake's story is done, and wow, what a story it was. A quiet farmer, an old red tractor, and a mean lady named Karen who thought she could boss everyone around. She yelled, she smirked, she parked her shiny car right in Jake's way. But Jake? He didn't yell back. He didn't fight with words. He just used what he had, his tractor and a chain, and let his actions do the talking. And boy, did they talk loud. Think about it for a second. Karen was the loudest person in town. She shouted about Jake's chickens, his tractor, his dirt, everything. She acted like she was the biggest, the best, the boss of it all. She thought being loud made her strong. She thought it made her win. But sometimes, the people who act the loudest are the ones who fall the hardest. Karen fell hard right onto her own lawn, with her car sitting there, dusty and scratched, while everyone laughed. She didn't see it coming. Not one bit. Jake was different. He was quiet. Super quiet. He didn't need to shout or wave his arms or make a big fuss. He just did his work, day after day, with his tractor and his farm. When Karen pushed him, he didn't push back with noise. He didn't call her names or stomp around. He thought about it. He made a plan. And then boom, he moved her car, cool as ice, and showed her who was really smart. That's the thing about Jake, he didn't play her game. He made his own rules, and he won. So here's a little idea for you, friends. Next time someone tries to push you around, remember Jake. Maybe it's a kid at school who's being mean, saying stuff to make you mad. Maybe it's someone telling you what to do, acting like they're better than you. You don't have to yell back. You don't have to cry or run away. You don't have to play their game at all. You can be like Jake, think smart, stay calm, and use what you've got to show them they're wrong. Outsmart them, not outshout them. That's the trick. Let's picture it. Say there's a bully at school. He's loud, like Karen, always bragging and picking on you. He takes your pencil or laughs at your shoes. You could yell at him, but he'd just laugh more. You could tell the teacher, but maybe he'd sneak back later. Or you could be like Jake. Maybe you wait, watch, and find a way to fix it yourself. Like, you draw a funny picture of him and show it to your friends, and suddenly he's the one who's embarrassed. No yelling, no fighting, just smarts. That's Jake's way. Or maybe it's not a bully. Maybe it's a big job you have to do, like cleaning your room or finishing homework, and it feels too hard. You could complain and stomp around, like Karen did when things didn't go her way. But that doesn't help. Instead, you could be like Jake, look at what you've got, make a plan, and get it done. Maybe you use a fun song to make cleaning fast. Maybe you break your homework into little pieces so it's not scary. You don't need to shout about it, you just do it, step by step, and win. Jake's story shows us something big. You don't need to be the loudest to be the strongest. You don't need fancy stuff like Karen's shiny car or big house to be the best. You just need what you've got inside you, your brain, your ideas, your heart. Jake had a tractor and a chain, sure, but he also had patience. He had smarts. He had a quiet kind of power that Karen never saw coming. And when he used it, squeak, that car moved, everyone knew who he really was. Think about Karen for a minute. She had everything: money, a fancy house, a car she loved. But she wasn't happy. She spent her days yelling, complaining, trying to make Jake feel small. And what did it get her? A scratched car, a dusty lawn, and a whole town laughing at her. She fell hard because she didn't think. She didn't plan. She just shouted and pushed, and it all came crashing down. That's what happens when you try to win by being loud instead of being smart. Now think about Jake. He didn't have a big house or a shiny car. He had a little farm, an old tractor, and some chickens. But he was happy. He worked hard, he stayed calm, and when he had to, he stood up for himself. He didn't need to brag or yell, he just did what needed doing. And when it was over, people didn't just like him, they loved him. They waved, they smiled, they called him a hero. That's what happens when you use your head and let your actions talk. So what's the lesson here, friends? It's simple. You've got power inside you, quiet power, like Jake's. You don't need to scream it out loud for it to be real. Next time someone tries to push you around, whether it's a mean kid, a tough day, or even a silly problem like a stuck toy, you can be the one who wins. Not by being loud, but by being clever. Use what you've got. Make a plan. Show them they can't stop you. That's how you come out on top. Let's imagine one more thing. Picture you're Jake, sitting on that tractor. Someone's blocking your way, not with a car, maybe, but with words or tricks. They're laughing, thinking they've got you beat. What do? You don't jump off and yell. You don't give up and walk away. You sit there, think, and find your chain, your smart idea. Then you pull, slow and steady, until they're the ones surprised. That's you, friends. That's your power. You've got it, even if it's quiet. What did you think of Jake's move? Wasn't it awesome? That moment when the car slid squeak and Karen's jaw dropped? I bet you cheered. I know I did. Jake didn't need a big speech or a fancy fight. He just hooked up that chain, fired up his tractor, and showed her. It's the kind of thing that sticks with you, right? A little farmer beating a big bully with nothing but smarts and a rusty old machine. That's a story worth telling. So tell me, friends, what did you think? Did Jake do the right thing? Would you have done the same? Maybe you'd have used your own tractor or your own clever idea to fix it? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, I can't wait to hear them. Tell me if you liked watching Karen's face turn red, or if you'd have cheered with the neighbors when that car moved. And hey, while you're at it, let me know where you're reading from today. Are you at home? At school? Somewhere cool? I want to know. This isn't the end, you know. There are more stories out there, more Jakes, more Karens, more big wins. Stick around, because I've got plenty more to share. Next time, maybe it'll be a kid with a bike, or a girl with a plan, or even a dog who outsmarts someone silly. You won't want to miss it. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't yet, and let's keep the fun going. See you in the next story, friends. But before we go, let's think one last time. Jake's move wasn't just about a tractor or a car. It was about standing up. It was about saying, nope, you don't get to push me around, without even raising his voice. You can do that too. You've got your own tractor, maybe it's your ideas, your courage, your little tricks. And when someone tries to block your way, you can move them not with shouts, but with smarts. That's the secret. That's the power. And that's what makes you strong, just like Jake. So go out there, friends. Be a Jake, not a Karen. Use what you've got. Think clever thoughts. And when the loud ones try to trip you up, just smile, hook up your chain, and pull. They'll never see it coming. See you next time.